Decarbonization, renewable energy, net zero, greenwashing, climate mitigation and adaptation, pollution. The list goes on and on. They're all concepts we've heard a lot about over the years. But what role do they play together in the fight against climate change? And how can they transition us to a world where sustainable energy is the default it should be? Here to take us through this session from the moderator's chair is an award-winning investigative journalist and former news presenter with a 25-year-long career at BBC World News, Nisha Pillay. Nisha will kick off by discussing how access to sustainable energy can become a global good for all, with two distinguished panelists. First, with more than 30 years of experience in international development economics and environmental sustainability, we're lucky to have the executive director of the UN Environment Program, Inger Andersen. And joining her will be Sharon Burrow, a high school teacher turned general secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, which promotes and defends workers' rights and interests through international cooperation. From there, Nisha will welcome two final speakers. We'll hear from someone who sees the potential of harnessing capitalism for positive change. Founder and executive chairman of the impact investment group Engine No. 1, Chris James. And we'll also welcome Varanya Andrea, the Senior Advisor for Sustainable Energy with the UN Development Program in Indonesia, who's been working on clean energy program development for more than 15 years. It's a packed session, to say the least. So let's get this great energy transition started.
We're living through a time of massive environmental crisis and challenge. Wherever we look, we seem to be being hit by fires and floods and deluges and droughts, seemingly simultaneously. And after years of being taken for granted, the planet is fighting back. The debate is no longer about the need for change. More, it's about how we deliver meaningful action with the clock ticking, with time against us. The energy transition, the theme of today's SDG Action Zone, is not the only transition, of course, or transformation, as I like to call it, that we need to get right. But it sits at the very heart of our challenge to protect both planet and people. And today we're going to drill down on what we need to do to make the energy transition truly transformative. As ever, on the SDG Action Zone, we're going to bring you two perspectives. Our panel discussions have both a global and a local flavor. Plus, we have an interview with the president of the African Development Bank. And we're going to be asking all our speakers what they themselves are doing and what they think that we should all do in order to accelerate and scale up the energy transition and how to inspire others to do the same. So let's get started with our first panel discussion. I'd like to introduce you to Inger Andersen, the Executive Director of UNEP, the UN's Environment Program, who joins us from Nairobi. Welcome, Inger.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And in Belgium, I think, joining us from Brussels, we have Sharon Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Unions Conference. Hi there, Sharon. Good to have you with us.
Great to be here for such a good discussion.
Now, let's take it as read that the energy transition is a vital part of the wholesale resetting of our relationship with Mother Earth. The question, therefore, that I'm going to put to you both is, what can we do to speed up, to truly accelerate the energy transition so that it works both for planet and people? And I'm going to put that first to Inger Andersen, please.
Well, I think we start at home. We start with the understanding that households drive more than 1/3 of all CO2 emissions. So understanding that what we do, our own footprint, the choices we make, how we live, how we transport ourselves, how we waste food, each of these, how we turn off the light. Many people say, what can I do? These are bigger systemic shifts. Yes. But everything starts with one action, and the action starts at home. Secondly, of course, we need to understand that for these significant transitions that have to happen, we need to understand that the people we put in government make the transitions for us. So taking intergenerational justice with us into the ballot box, matters. You can't, this is not a left or right issue. This is a future generations issue, because there is no planet. If we have no planet, there is no profit. There are no economies. There are no jobs. And so we can't afford not to do it. Now, I sit in UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. We deal with the science of all of this. And recently, IPCC, which we are proud to co-host with our friends at the World Meteorological Organization, issued this report. And I said at the launch of that, look, we've been issuing the science with ever greater precision for 30 years, and the world has listened, but it didn't hear. I do think that now, because the visuals are not a PowerPoint to the IPCC report, as you just said, Nisha, the visuals are what we're seeing on our television screen. The visuals are what we're seeing in our houses, our homes, our cities, our streets, our forests, our beaches, etc. So the visuals are very real. I do believe that means that more and more people are actually stepping up and demanding change. They're demanding it in a number of ways, right? Things they can do themselves, things they expect and demand from those who sit in decision-making positions, but they're also voting with their euros or their Kenyan shillings or their dollars in terms of the kind of change they want to see through their purchasing power. Now, we are not
very interesting, Ingat. I'm going to jump in there. It's not at all
Sure.
what I thought you'd say. I thought you'd be talking about big changes from above, but you're talking about the power of change from below. We'll unpack that in a minute. First, I'd like to ask Sharon Burrow how she sees it. What do you think we really need to do right now to accelerate the energy transition so that it delivers something that works for planet and people?
Well, Inga's right. We're in a race against time. And if you read even the summary of the IPCC report, it depicts a horror movie that is with us now, but indeed will get worse. So nobody can walk away from the fact that every sector, every household has to transition. So where do you start? For us, it's very simple. If we have a convergence of crises, which is massive levels of inequality, exclusion, and indeed we have a climate crisis, we have to put people and the planet at the centre of the way we look to what we want for the future. Now, energy, in the sense of the climate transition, is absolutely at the core of that. But it's not only the climate transition. There are jobs in energy. If I told you there were 32% of women in the energy sector, not often talked about when we talk about coal mines and fossil fuels and the just transition we demand for those workers, quite often people simply fail to understand. This is a universal agenda. We know from polling, Inga's right, our own polling, that overwhelmingly the majority of people want action on climate. They look to their governments, and their governments must step up. The ambition going into the COP this year is quite frighteningly low. But at the same time, we must all look to what we can do. So we would say to you that from a worker's perspective, good jobs, investment in renewable energy, for every 10 jobs, as we try to build a just recovery, every 10 jobs in renewable energy, there are 5 to 10 in the manufacturing or service supply chain. And indeed, if we get those jobs right, there's 30 to 35 in the broader economy that actually generates confidence that we are building an inclusive future. So yes,
investment in what could be a golden lever, a green lever of transformation that cascades through the whole economy.
Absolutely. People
so now let's go
planet.
back to what we as people can do, because Inga Anderson, most people, I think, just feel helpless about the changes that are coming down the runway at us, and what we can achieve. Our decision making is rather limited in the face of major energy companies that supply us with our power, or transport systems which we don't have any control over.
Yes and no, Nisha, yes and no, which is why I began with look, actually it's our consumption, our production patterns that are driving this situation that we're in. Households themselves are responsible for a significant proportion of CO2 emissions. And the G20 countries alone, those 20 rich countries, are responsible for 78% of all emissions. So let's get real, first of all. The to-do list is with the wealthy, and let's understand that the 1% of the population, the richest 1%, emits more than the double of the poorest 50%. Now, we also need to understand that the richest 1% of the world earns around, what, $109,000 a year. I'm saying this because we need to understand that many of us live in the 1%, right? So that's sort of a reality here. Just hold on a minute. Now, over and above that, what we need to understand is then that we have more say than maybe we think we have. Many of us have pensions. What are we demanding of our pension funds? Where does it go? Many of us in the wealthier world have houses. How big do we choose to live? How often do we choose to travel? Because the inequity that Sharon is speaking about, the unequal nature of this is something that is very real. I sit in Africa. We are at the front end of the climate crisis. We see it every day, and yet we are not responsible. I can't call myself we, but Africa is not responsible for this dramatic situation. And you know that many countries in Africa have 30-40% access to electricity, just electricity. And so we need to expand the energy network here, which is why climate finance matters, which is why what was promised back in COP15 of climate in Copenhagen, the 100 billion a year, have to be delivered. Otherwise, we will see a growing inequity between the two, and that becomes a critical piece also to understand. The rich
so let's go back to that point you made earlier, Inge, which was about how each one of us in the rich world can control our own consumption, how we travel, how much energy we use at home, etc. What are you advocating then? That we should all be investing in energy efficient products and better insulation, or because we can't just rebuild our environment, can we?
I think it's lifestyle choices that we can make and that we need to be mindful of. Look, 1/5 of all the food that goes into our refrigerators in wealthy countries ends in the garbage can. So what is that? We've spent the biodiversity, we've spent the insecticides, the pesticides, we are emitting methane from the rotting food, but it doesn't go in to feed a single mouth. So no, we do need to think about the choices. And that does not mean restricting our ways of life. It means being smart, being nature positive, understand that choices, this limitless end to expanding of production and consumption, we need to understand we have just one planet. Right now we are expended it as if we had, more than that. And we're pushing against the very planetary boundaries. So I think these are the kind of things that we just need to understand. If you go back one generation, it was a different life and a different expectations, but wealth, this enormous wealth that has been generated, shared by only a few countries, we need to have an understanding that that's not sustainable at the end of the day.
But Inge's right.
Yes, go on, Sharon. You're about to jump in anyway.
Inge's absolutely right that people have power. They have power in their own lives and their own choices, but they also have power in their workplaces, power through their political processes. And on September 22nd, you say, what can people do? We say, ask your employer. It's called CAPOW, Climate and Employment Proof Our Workplaces. Ask your employer to sit down and have a conversation with you. What's the plan for climate proofing and employment proofing your workplace? You can do the same with your home, but you can also demand of employers, governments, investors, everywhere you can, that we have to invest in our common home, because Inge's right. We have one home. It's called Earth. It's the planet. Now, when you think about the fact that the companies that don't want to give up our fossil fuel footprint, and for us, that's very painful because we have really good jobs in fossil fuels, but we also know we have to build good jobs in renewable energy. But the companies that are being forced in our wealthy nations by investors, by governments to transition, are simply setting up shop in Africa. And right now we're at risk of only having 10% of renewable energy in Africa, or equivalent in other parts of the poorer world. That's not the future we want.
One of the reasons why things are going more slowly in the richer world and the growing world is because the energy transition is so painful for people in the fossil fuel industries who have good jobs. So what does a just transition really mean? Can you make it tangible? Because I've never really understood what happens to people who work in coal mines and in big power stations and big polluters after they go.
Well, it's very simple, actually. It's first of all about those companies accepting they have to transition and then taking responsibility for their workers and the community. So there's just a few things that would give people hope. One is that indeed they would know they have secure pensions if indeed they're going to be displaced close to retirement, or a bridge to pensions if they choose to take that route. If they're workers in a coal-fired power station, there's no reason they can't be a worker in a solar thermal power station, but they need the skills, the income support while they're retraining, and the redeployment support. And of course, we need to see investment in those communities. So unless we're serious about what kind of world we want, and do we want a world that shares prosperity? Why do we make wealth if we're not prepared to share it? Do we want a world that is indeed climate proof, that stabilizes the planet and gives both ourselves and future generations hope? Do we want to be good ancestors? Then all of us have to actually stand our ground and say, yes, it's painful. I think I'm one of the few people that will talk about the SDGs who's walked the coal fields or talked to fossil fuel workers. But we used to have telecommunications companies where, you know, they were good jobs for women who sat and plugged the cord into the holes that connected your phone. It doesn't work like that anymore. So transitions we're used to. Just transition is where we actually say we want an inclusive and a shared and responsible future, and employers can't simply want to make money from destroying the planet or destroying the human and labour rights of workers.
So we've talked about the responsibilities of citizens, of all of us as voters and as consumers. We've talked about the responsibilities of corporations and big employers. Sharon has been telling us about some of the challenges. We haven't talked a lot about the responsibilities of nation states at the highest level. So I want to ask Inga, what are you doing, Ra? What do you find most frustrating when you work with, say, G20 countries in trying to persuade them to really make the painful decisions in policy to, for instance, close the door on coal?
You know, they're navigating exactly what Sharon said, the interest versus jobs, short-termism. Will the government be re-elected next term if we make these difficult transitions? But there are some real opportunities that we are engaging on. You know, $4.7 trillion go into fossil fuel subsidies, right? 4.7 trillion a year. Now, we need to have a conversation about 4.7 trillion. That's not small potatoes, that's serious money. And imagine if we begin to shift that towards something else, like, for example, renewables. Imagine what that could do. So I get that for the poor in many countries, we want to have a cheaper source of energy because having to power your home is complicated and expensive. As I say, I sit here in Kenya where they've liberalized off-grid provision of power. There's a company called Mkopa. You borrow $1,000, you get a solar panel on the roof, and you have household-based energy. You pay it off with very little every month. Will countries be willing to let go of the control by the central electricity companies and allow for these things? Similarly, here in Kenya, since I'm sitting here, I'll give a little PR. They've invested heavily in geothermal and in wind. And so there are real opportunities. Kenya was an early adopter of wind, 20 years of geothermal. They sit, after all, on the African rift. But, you know, it is looking at these opportunities, and the wealthier world needs to put the R&D to work, research and development. So governments, they set the guardrails. They set the guardrails for what will happen. You can subsidize to the toxic, and the dirty, or you can subsidize towards the green. You can enable policies that will take us the right way. Similarly with urban planning, you know, what kind of urban planning?
I want to just give Sharon
place?
one last final word to bring our discussion to a close before we run out of time. Tell us about what I've heard the trade unions are working about on a great deal, this new social contract. What promise does it hold for us as we try to navigate this uncertain future?
Well, you know, the social contract's broken. When you actually have 60% of the world's workers informally, many of them without energy, you know, that Inga was talking about and you were talking about. By the way, just as an aside, in Africa, it would take 50 billion to actually, not a trillion, to close the energy security gap. Imagine if we did that with renewables. That would give everybody hope and create formal jobs. So jobs, there are 5 demands for a new social contract to build a robust and healthy climate economy. Jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs with just transition, rights, because if you don't have human and labour rights, and I would add environmental standards, we're setting the world up for failure and we're not turning around a failed economic model. The social protection, universal social protection. So you build resilience, invest in those care sectors, so exposed by COVID, but so necessary for global shocks, including climate shocks. Equality, income, gender and race, and inclusion. Let's get the SDGs. Let's get the Paris Climate Agreement. Let's reform the multilateral system, raise government ambition. We all can play a role, but everybody has to want a stable planet with an inclusive future.
Hear, hear. Sharon Burrow, Inga Anderson, you're both such convincing advocates for just change. Thank you so much for joining us on the SDG Action Zone discussion on the energy transition.
Hello again, and Nisha, I'm with you. People and planet have got to be at the center of our future. For this next part of the panel, I'll be taking over for Nisha and chatting with someone who's been named Forbes magazine's African of the Year not once, but twice, in 2013 and 2019. In his role as president of the African Development Bank, he is driving the bank's multi-billion-dollar investments to transform Africa. Please welcome Dr. Akinwumi Adesina. Hello.
Hi, good to see you.
You as well. While the global perspective is so useful in delivering cross-border systems change, we just heard UN leader Inga Anderson mention in that last conversation that everything starts with one action, and action starts at home. So I want to hone in on what's actually happening at home, or at least in the regional level in Africa. So in the history of the African Development Bank and other development partners, there have been many attempts to reduce and end energy poverty. Most of these efforts felt targeted at industry, premised on the idea that prosperity and progress, of course, trickle down wherever it's needed. But both industry and citizens are important. I think we can all agree. So how do you balance that to deliver real impact for everyone?
Well, thanks. Actually, you know, I think that it's kind of a false dichotomy, actually, because when you take a look at the issue of energy in Africa, we just need more energy, period. Right? You need energy for industries to be able to industrialize, right? And that creates jobs and stimulates the economy, right? Energy is like blood in your veins. You have it, you have life. You don't have it, you don't have life, okay? It's almost like that for economies as well. And secondly, you also need it for households. And so since we actually started, when I was elected president in 2015, we launched a massive effort called New Deal on Energy for Africa. It is to actually accelerate the pace of what you're saying in terms of energy, not only for households, but also for industries to be able to industrialize. So which means you have to combine grid-based energy with mini-grid systems and decentralized energy systems for households. And it's working quite well. You know, in the last 5 years that we've done this, we've been able to actually provide electricity access to 21 million people. These are real citizens in Africa. But just to give you a sense of what that is on the ground, I went to Kenya once, and we have a project there that's called the Last Mile Connectivity Project. Essentially, it is to help poor households to get connected to the grid because the cost of connection is often very, very expensive for them. And so I went in there, we got over there, and there was a lady right behind me, and her name was Grace, I recall. And she said, well, look, somebody will say, well, that's President Adesina of the African Development Bank. You know what she said? Oh, I don't know President Adesina of the African Development Bank. All I know is that I was once in the dark and now I have light, and I was so happy because she was one of the 1.2 million households that we have in Kenya, last mile connectivity project that is giving them access to electricity. And I must say that governments are doing a terrific job, Nadra, because you look at Kenya, for example, in 2010, they only had 20% of their population with access to electricity. In 2019, they got 70% of the population doing that. Now, last week, my board at the bank here just approved a project, $80 million project for Burkina Faso, which is in the Sahel. It's very difficult and so on. It is to connect 218,000 people to electricity. Again, the cost of connection for the poor, because the point you're raising is access. And it's a very important point. You know, it takes them about roughly 80,000 CFA to 218,000 CFA to connect a poor household. It's very, very expensive. So under this project, we say, okay, well, we're going to make that 3,000. So you connect that 3,000 and then you pay the rest over a 3-year period. And that will provide 218,000 people with electricity. You look at Cote d'Ivoire, where I'm sitting right now, we're doing that also with solar single home-based systems for 100,000 people. In Nigeria and rural areas, we're doing almost 120,000. And in Sudan, for example, we're helping poor farmers to have access to solar-driven irrigation systems. That probably will do about 2,000 farmers. So that's just to tell you what it is. It is real people getting access to electricity at scale, and that's what we have to do. Access, affordability, and security of energy access, but including, of course, clean cooking energy. It really breaks my heart, that we have 300,000 people, women that die every year in Africa just for trying to cook a decent meal, for God's sake, right? And their kids, 300,000 die also for that because of secondary impact of smoke. And so we are also working to provide access to clean cooking energy for women. We have provided support to a company that's called Spark Plus, which is allowing them to reach 2 million households with access to clean cooking energy that, of course, will also reduce CO2 emissions. So it is about real people. That's what we do every day. And I think that we just have to continue to push.
The work is happening. And I love that Grace stayed with you in that way, because it tells us a lot of what we need to know about where the actual work is. Now, of course, Africa is blessed with so many natural resources and the potential for clean energy, solar, geothermal, and of course, though it's less reliable, there's hydro energy in many places as well. So why are there still energy investment projects that include fossil fuels? And how can a full energy transition to renewables become a reality?
Well, if you take a look, I think God loves Africa because, you got sun, we got too much sun, actually. I can tell you, we've got 11 gigawatts of, terawatts of it. We've got 350 gigawatts of hydropower, 150, gigawatts of wind and geothermal power, huge. But nobody uses potential, you got to actually unlock potential. So all we've got to be doing is unlocking that potential at scale. I'll tell you something. Since we started as a bank, just to the point in terms of the energy transition you were saying, right? We were putting in 2016, only 9% of our investment were actually in renewable energy when we started. Today, 73%.
That's so dramatic.
73, very dramatic. It's gone. And I'm going to tell you some of it that's quite interesting. In Morocco, for example, we have supported what's called the new Ouazzazate, which is the world's largest concentrated solar power plant. I'm sure you know about that, that we co-financed with several others. We also did another one in Kenya, which is Lake Turkana in Kenya, which is 310 megawatts, all wind, which is Sub-Saharan Africa's largest wind power project. Now, we are also supporting several of these projects. Now, what we have just launched is something called Desert to Power. It's our biggest effort, right, in the Sahel that we were just talking about. With so much irrigation, the highest in the world, we've got to turn that into energy. And so we have launched a $20 billion initiative called Desert to Power that will help to generate 10,000 megawatts of electricity in the Sahel. And that will make that zone the largest solar zone in the world and provide electricity to 250 million people from both grid, mini-grid, and off-grid systems. And that's the kind of scale in which we're working. But I also realize that it's not just those unlocking those potential that matters, it's how do we deal with legacy projects. We have a number of legacy projects on coal. I have said When I came to the UN General Assembly about 2-3 years ago, I said, look, the African Development Bank is out of coal. Coal is the past. Green energy is the future. So I don't want to invest in the past with stranded assets. I want to invest in the future. And that's why, we have a program called the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, which allows us to actually support energy transitions. And so something called green base load power, a project. So I give you a concrete example. Take the case of Namibia and Botswana. Those two countries depend on South Africa, which of course is always using coal. Coal is the main source of energy. But we developed this program called a mega solar project that will allow the development of 2 to 5 gigawatts of electricity via solar. And that will reduce their dependency on having to rely on coal-fired plants from South Africa for access to electricity. And that will reduce their CO2 emissions by 6.5 million tons. And if you look at what that is, it's probably about 1.5 million cars taken off the road just at once. It's just to tell you the scale at which we need to go. So I really feel we are continuing to drive on renewable energy, but we do need to have innovative financing mechanisms to allow us to be able to decommission legacy projects and allow more transition to clean energy.
Which is actually a perfect place for me to ask my next question, which is, what do you need most from your shareholders, from member state governments, and from citizens around the continent to make this full energy transition?
I want you to join our shareholder group. I want to, we need everybody to be on this. Quite honestly, here is we need to turn the megawatts of words into megawatts of electricity, renewable energy, right? Because, rhetoric must become reality in many ways. First and foremost, is that we need to be square-eyed on this. That we need it will take $100 billion a year for the next probably until 2040 for Africa to achieve full energy transition. So it's a lot of money, but we've got to really make sure that these monies are there. Secondly, it's not just the money alone that will solve the problem. We have to make sure that the governments take action. Action in terms of regional energy markets. You can generate electricity, but there's no offtake for it. You have some places that have electricity and others that have deficit of electricity. So we've got to make sure that continue to make the regional energy market work, regional energy transmission projects work, which we invest a lot in. That's very important. But beyond that also are the utilities. The utilities make electricity to work, right? We must modernize the utilities and make sure that we have grid systems that are smart grid systems that can take the renewable energy sources with all the intermittency that they have and blend them with an energy mix that stabilizes the grid all across Africa. And I will also say that the issue of pricing of energy, it's very, very important. In most cases, the inefficiencies of the utility drives up the cost of electricity. So we're going to make them much more efficient. And finally, you must have cost reflective tariff, because who is going to invest in energy if they're not sure there's going to be offtake and people are going to be able to afford the electricity? And finally is, we are looking towards the Glasgow right now in terms of the COP26. The nationally determined contributions that many of the countries have in which they put their energy mixes in. Remember, these are basically conditional, or let me say aspirational goals that they set for themselves. Well, guess what? These aspirations were set based on the promise that was going to be $100 billion a year provided by developed countries to developing countries to be able to do many of these things. They need to prepare the projects. They need to de-risk the project. You need co-finance it at scale for bankable projects. If those monies are not there, then we are not going to be able to reach it. But I think it's time, that we turn these promises into real money on the table, and so that we can continue to make the progress and at scale that we are doing.
This is an incredible conversation. And Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, it is wonderful to hear about all the work that's happening, but it's also wonderful to hear how clear-eyed you are about what needs to happen so that we get the future that we want. And there are so many tweetable moments in here to our audience. If you're not joining the conversation right now, then you're missing out, because we do need to turn the megawatts of energy, or rather the megawatts of words, into the megawatts of energy. It's a natural place for us to transition to the final chapter of the great energy transition conversation, where our speakers are about to take things local. So with that, back to you, Nisha.
And now we're going to go to what we call our local panel. Well, what do we mean by that? Let's cross over to San Francisco. We're joined by Chris James, who runs Engine Number One. It's an activist hedge fund investor just trying to catalyze change in some of the biggest boardrooms in the US. Hello there, Chris. Good to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And from Indonesia, from Jakarta, we are joined by Virania Andrea, who is a UNDP consultant working with small-scale projects trying to bring electricity to far-flung communities, but also at the opposite end of the scale with the Indonesian government too. What on earth could they have in common? Well, that's what we're about to find out. I'd like to start by asking both of you, please, whether it really is possible to deliver tangible changes to shift the energy curve by working as you do in a bottom-up sort of way. So first, Chris, what were you trying to achieve when you worked to change the board composition of ExxonMobil, the biggest US oil and gas giant? You're trying to do the same in other big polluters. What's the aim of the game?
Well, we felt that Exxon in particular was an outlier. It was a company who had not really yet expressed what role they were actually going to play in the energy transition. Instead, they had many policies, lobbying efforts, and even their core tactics were trying to prevent the energy transition from actually taking place. There's clearly been an array of press releases this year, but up until we actually were able to obtain 3 board seats, we didn't really feel that the path that they were on was going to be consistent with what society's goals really are right now.
And do you think that by virtue of your campaign and changing the composition of the board and that outside scrutiny, they are really going to make meaningful changes, a huge oil and gas giant like Exxon?
I do, actually. But I think should set nations. This is a huge company that has been doing one thing, really producing fossil fuels for the last 100 and something years. This is not going to be quick. It's not going to be easy. I think that through the course of the campaign, though, what was probably most catalyzing was the groundswell of support from whether it was index investors, whether it was individual investors, whether it was more active mutual fund or hedge fund type investors, to actually start to finally connect environmental risk to business risk. And that made the debate less of a debate and more of what is it we need to do in order to drive value for the company that is consistent with society's goals instead of on the other side of that.
Right. I'd like to come back to you to find out more about how you brought together this coalition. But first, sure, let's speak to Virania Andrea in Jakarta. Virania, you've been working to electrify many, many villages, remote communities in the many islands of the Indonesian archipelago. What's your model been about to bring electricity to people who've had hardly any of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what we are trying to do is to shift the approach that usually the remote areas and community electrification is actually provided based on donors or philanthropic funding or even government-owned funding. So what we would like to introduce is how can we design together with the government to have the certain market scale that can attract the private sector to invest in electrifying the remote areas. So remember that Indonesia has 17,000 islands. So clustering them actually can make a certain sizable market.
So what are the arguments that you've used to cluster these disparate villages and bring them to a portfolio that's attractive to investors?
Yeah, I think we can take the benefit from for example, the advanced technology on solar PV that can in the simpler way actually installed in with the same type of technology in a close nearby islands and villages. And so with the same technology, you can have a cheaper price while you are reaching out more villages and communities. in terms of numbers. So that's one of the arguments. But we also can introduce a mix between, for example, a hybrid of the diesel and the renewable resources.
Okay, so you've both been talking about the way in which private sector investors can affect meaningful change to try and shift the curve of the energy transition. Chris, tell us a bit more about, say, exchange-traded funds. That's what most people think of in terms of, you know, the good investment, the sustainable investment. Does it have a role? I noticed that engine number one seems to have launched one.
Yeah, our view is a little different. So we believe pretty strong that the vote of an individual investor, the vote of an index investor or an active investor has not been utilized to its full extent. I think in many ways, I think that the idea of giving your vote to another institution, which has traditionally been the case, a large institution with index funds, that people to some degree just don't think a large institution will necessarily make a big change for another large institution. Our theory of change is that the power of the vote, and we launched an ETF, actually the ticker is vote, which tells you as much as you need to know. Like, how could that ticker be available after 30 something years of index products? People didn't view that as something that was the ability to affect change. What we did, which was, I think, really different, was we built a coalition. You know, activist hedge funds, which we try not to keep that. That's not a name that we really consider what we are. Activist hedge funds have traditionally been focused on short-term financial engineering. What we were really able to do is build a coalition, and we were able to build a coalition because we were able to take again this idea of environmental risk and make it economic risk. And that was able to bring together people who whose first priority was their shareholdings. It was also able to bring priority to people who have like large ESG voting groups who really feel that you can tie this together long term. And so I think that was really the alchemy that we were able to do. But it was all around this broader idea that your vote matters. You have to think about it. And by the way, if all the people who divested, who had talked about divesting from oil and gas companies had actually done so, we wouldn't have won 3 board seats on Exxon. So our theory of change is you have to run towards the problem. You can't run away from the problem. And the divestment is not the right answer.
Interesting point. So I want to pick up that idea that environmental risk is moving into economic risk, and we need to run towards the problem with Verania. I know that you're also advising the Indonesian government on projects on completely the other scale, the really big power projects. Now, Indonesia, like many Asian fast-growing countries, depends on coal to deliver power to its citizens and to its workplaces. How are you using this argument of environmental and economic risk to persuade the government to give up on coal?
That's the tough question, and also tough to be answered by the government of Indonesia. We have the country around more than 60% of the power source from the coal. So shifting from that will have a big impact. Coal is not only responsible for the economy, but also for the power sector. So you will have 2 big risks. So what we are trying to discuss with the government, the argument here is that if we want to advocate for the coal phasing out, then we have to be able to address how can we deal with the economic risk and also with the environmental risk. So the economic risk that we discuss with the government is, for example, how can we calculate how much that will cost if we want to shut down some of the coal power plant, how much we have to recover the funding, for example, to retire some coal power plant, and the idea that we discussed with the government, how can we do that introducing, for example, the carbon pricing, the cap and trade. That's voluntary trial that we are doing with the government of Indonesia targeting the coal power plant. So this is the first voluntary trial that we set up with the government, the cap of the emission of the coal power plant, and then voluntarily asking them to start trading the emission and also offsetting that to the renewable energy power plants.
And where have you got to with this scheme, the carbon cap and trade scheme? Has it delivered any results yet, or is it too early to say?
Actually, we are just trying this trial this year, and we expect that in October that will be the final decision of the voluntary participants of the coal power plant. But we are happy that at least there are 80 coal power plants industries are participating in this.
Okay.
Yeah, so
that's like the idea that Chris had about running towards the problem and working with rather than running away from. Chris, can I just ask you to unpack that thought for us a bit more, really? Where do you see the big polluters of the world? We're talking about ExxonMobil, but it's by no means the only one. We also have major heavy industry, chemicals and fertilizers, that kind of thing, certain transport sectors. These are really stubborn areas to tackle. Where do you see this kind of involvement process of people like yourself leading these industries? What kind of shift can you meaningfully deliver?
I think we're at the precipice of just dramatic change across multiple industries. And what the big catalyst has been really transparency into what the impacts of these businesses really are. The ability to quantify, we've been working for the last several years on this idea of how can we quantify the impacts, how can we put them into a framework, and then how can we take the output of this and tie it to value creation? Because I think there's one message that every company, regardless of the size of its impact on the environment or it's on its communities, the common language is you put a dollar number on what this is and you tie it to how well the stock is going to do. You show that value creation is really in many ways is a way in which you monetize the positive impacts you have on society. And society, what is society? And when you talk to these companies, they're potential customers. And so if you don't align your own values as a company with the values of your customers, in a world where you see more transparency, it's going to be a problem for your business. Conversely, the real opportunity for first movers, take mobility. I don't think there's a better example of Tesla, whose ability to monetize the positive impact they have on society ultimately gets into how many cars they sell and what the margins are. And I think there's a huge opportunity for all of the first movers across mobility to be able to monetize what is effectively their customer goals. And that's a language that we can all agree on. Getting the data on that is obviously quite hard and quite a challenge, and something that we spend. That is our one of the I think the next release that we talk about as a firm is going to be what we call our total value framework. And that is putting a value on all of these impacts or externalities, and seeing how over time those do get internalized and how that drives or destroys value for a company.
So Varanya, I want to ask you now about how you create value in communities. An awful lot is said about the need to involve communities into new energy projects, but what does it mean on the ground in your experience?
Yeah, well, we see that actually, of course, the basic needs. So when we work with the community and we create the value that it's not about the renewable energy at first, it's about access to the electricity, access to the energy. So that's what's important for the communities. So when we introduce that actually they can utilize the existing resources in the surrounding, name it biomass, water, solar, for example, then they are okay with that because they will get the access, the electricity from that. So that's how we create the value for the community. I think we start with what is actually missing. What is the basic needs missing in that community? And then we expand that to other sectors. For example, for the for the educations, health, then also the internet access. We have an interesting experience where now we provide the access to electricity in the community, and then in the same time we engage the other government entity to bring in the internet access to that village, because they will need the electricity and we need the internet to monitor the sustainability of the installed infrastructure. So with the access to electricity, we go beyond the access of the energy to also the digital economy and other.
I'm moving away from this word energy transition into what it really means for people's lives. That's what I'm taking away from you. We started this SDG Action Zone with a call from the head of the UN Environment Programme, Inge Andersen, for all of us. She said it's really down to all of us as citizens to be involved in making this transition happen. It's not about the governments and the big corporations, but we've all got to get mobilized. And I said, well, how? So I want to ask you that then, briefly as a final thought. Chris James, what would your message be to people? I mean, there are shareholders everywhere. We all have our pensions. What would your message be about how, as concerned citizens, we might be able to do something powerful and positive?
And there's an incredible opportunity to galvanize all the shareholders to affect change. I think that people forget that the basic system, there is the ability to truly democratize capitalism. Capitalism and governments are the only two institutions, or I guess capitalism is an institution, the only two things that have the scale to actually truly affect change in the time frame that we actually need it to happen. And so everyone can participate in capitalism. Everyone can participate in voting for the companies. Everyone can actually have a voice here. And I think that's one of the big messages that we try to deliver to the institutional investors, to the retail investors for Exxon. Because Exxon, for example, has 44% of the total shares are in retail hands. That was the reason, apparently, why everyone thought that no one could ever win a proxy contest against Exxon. Well, there actually is a message that resonates with Exxon shareholders. And that message is that the risk that we see, you cannot have a strategy that is based on society's inability to achieve their goals. You need to have a strategy that helps galvanize people to help them achieve their goals, and they can use their vote to actually do this. And I think
Chris, I'm going to take the speaker back and away from you. You can use your vote to actually do this. A great end message. Verania, what does Inge Andersen's call for us all to get involved mean to you sitting in Jakarta?
I think we have to diversify. Depends on the target. So if we want to see the targets or the stakeholders, the partner is the community with that lacking the basic needs, then you do the different approach, like for example, providing them with the access, expand it to other resources. But when we target the middle income country, say for example what James doing, then you can start by voting your own actions. I, for example, can install the solar rooftop on my carport, and also the youth students can start trying the electric motorcycle. So I think diversifying the approach, knowing what is actually the gap and the interest of that groups, then everyone can move in different direction, different style, but with the same goal.
Verania, Andrea, and Chris James, it's been a pleasure speaking to you both. Actually, it's been very inspirational speaking to you both. Thank you so much for joining us on the SDG Action Zone. And do remember, all of you, wherever you're joining us from, your thoughts really count, your actions really count. Continue the conversation on our social media platforms. From me, Nisha Pillay, goodbye for now.